Listen to a conversation between a student and a professor.
Hi, I was wondering if I could talk with you about the assignment in the film theory class.
Of course, Jill.
It seems that pretty much everyone else in the class gets what they're supposed to be doing, but I'm not so sure.
Well, the class is for students who are really serious about film. You must have taken film courses before.
Yeah, in high school. Film appreciation?
I wouldn't think that'd be enough. Did you concentrate mainly on form or content?
Oh, definitely content. We'd watch, say, Lord of the Flies and then discuss it.
Oh, that approach, treating film as literature, ignoring what makes it unique?
I liked it, though.
Sure, but that kind of class, well, I'm not surprised you're feeling a little lost. You know, we have 2 introductory courses that are supposed to be taken before you get to my course. One in film art, techniques, technical stuff, and another in film history. So students in the class you're in should be pretty far along in film studies. In fact, usually the system blocks anyone trying to sign up for a class they shouldn't be taking, who hasn't taken the courses you're required to do first as prerequisites.
Well, I did have a problem with that, but I discussed it with one of your office staff, and she gave me permission.
Of course. No matter how many times I tell them, they just keep on. Well, for your own good, I'd really suggest dropping back and starting at the usual place.
Yes, but I've already been in this class for 4 weeks. I'd hate to just drop it now, especially since I find it so different, so interesting.
I guess so. Frankly, I can't believe you've lasted this long. These are pretty in-depth theories we've been discussing, and you've been doing okay so far, I guess. But still, the program's been designed to progress through certain stages. Like any other professional training, we build on previous knowledge.
Then maybe you could recommend some extra reading I can do to catch up?
Well, are you intending to study film as your main concentration?
No, I'm just interested. I'm actually in marketing, but there seems to be a connection.
Oh, well, in that case, if you're taking the course just out of interest, I'd still highly recommend signing up for the introductory courses at some point. But in the meantime, there's no harm, I guess, in trying to keep up with this class. The interest is clearly there. Instead of any extra reading just now, though, you could view some of the old introductory lectures. We have them on video. That'd give you a better handle on the subject. It's still a pretty tall order, and we'll be moving right along, so you'll really need to stay on top of it.
Okay, I've been warned. Now, could I tell you about my idea for the assignment?
What is the conversation mainly about? What is the professor's attitude toward the student's high school film course? Why was the student permitted to sign up for the professor's film theory course? Why does the professor decide to allow the student to remain in his class? What does the professor advise the student to do in order to keep up with the class she is in? Listen to part of a lecture in a chemistry class.
Okay, I know you all have a lot of questions about this lab assignment that's coming up, so I'm going to take a little time this morning to discuss it. So, you know the assignment has to do with spectroscopy, right? And your reading should help you get a good idea of what that's all about. But let's talk about spectroscopy a little now, just to cover the basics. What is spectroscopy? Well, the simplest definition I can give you is that spectroscopy is the study of the interaction between matter and light. Now, visible light consists of different colors or wavelengths, which together make up what's called a spectrum, a band of colors like you see in a rainbow. And all substances, all forms of matter, can be distinguished according to what wavelengths of light they absorb and which ones they reflect. It's like, well, every element has what we call its own spectral signature. If we can read that signature, we can identify the element. And that's exactly what spectroscopy does. Now, laser spectroscopy, which is the focus of your assignment, works by measuring very precisely what parts of the spectrum are absorbed by different substances. And it has applications in a lot of different disciplines. And your assignment will be to choose a discipline that interests you and devise an experiment. For example, I'm going to talk about art. I'm interested in art. And to me, it's interesting how spectroscopy is used to analyze art. Let's say a museum curator comes to you with a problem. She's come across this painting that appears to be an original, say a Rembrandt, and she wants to acquire it for her museum. But she's got a problem. She's not absolutely certain it's an original. So, what do? How do you determine whether the painting's authentic? Okay, think about the scientific process. You've got a question. Is the painting a Rembrandt? So first, you'd need to make a list of characteristics the painting would have to be a Rembrandt. Then you have to discover whether the painting in question has those characteristics. So, first of all, you'll need to know the techniques Rembrandt used when he applied paint to canvas, his brushstrokes, how thickly he applied his paint. So you'd need to work with an art historian who has expert knowledge of Rembrandt's style. You'd have to know when he created his paintings, what pigments he used, in other words, what ingredients he used to make different colors of paint, because the ingredients used in paints and binding agents, plus varnishes, finishes, what have you, have changed over time. Since you're trying to verify if it's a Rembrandt, the ingredients in the pigment would need to have been used during Rembrandt's lifetime, in the 17th century. And that's where chemistry comes in. You've got to find out what's in those pigments, learn their composition, and that requires lab work, detective work, really. In a word, spectroscopy. So, how do we use spectroscopy? Well, we put an infrared microscope, a spectroscope, on tiny, tiny bits of paint, and using ultraviolet light, we can see the spectral signature of each component part of the pigment. Then, we compare these signatures with those of particular elements, like zinc or lead, to determine what the pigment was made of. So you can see why this type of analysis requires a knowledge of the history of pigments, right? How and when they were made. Say we determine a pigment was made with zinc, for example. We know the spectral signature of zinc, and it matches that of the paint sample. We also know that zinc wasn't discovered until the 18th century. And since Rembrandt lived during the 17th century, we know he couldn't have painted it. Now, spectroscopy has a very distinct advantage over previous methods of analyzing artworks because it's not invasive. You don't have to remove big chips of paint to do your analysis, which is what other methods require. All you do is train the microscope on tiny flecks of paint and analyze them. Now, a word or two about restoration. Sometimes original artworks appear questionable or inauthentic because they've had so many restorers add touch-up layers to cover up damage from the paint having deteriorated over time. Well, spectroscopy can reveal the composition of those touch-up layers too, so we can find out when they were applied. Then, if we want to undo some bad restoration attempts, we can determine what kind of process we can use to remove them, to dissolve the paint and uncover the original.
What is the main purpose of the lecture? What does the professor imply when he mentions an art historian? Why does the professor discuss the presence of zinc in paint pigments? According to the professor, what is the primary advantage of spectroscopy over other laboratory methods for analyzing artworks? What is one way the professor mentions that chemists can help with art restoration? Why does the professor say this?
Now, a word or two about restoration.
Listen to part of a lecture in a literature class.
Now, we can't really talk about fairy tales without first talking about folk tales, because there's a strong connection between these two genres, these two types of stories. In fact, many fairy tales started out as folk tales. So, what's a folk tale? How would you characterize them? Jeff?
Well, they're old stories, traditional stories. They were passed down orally within cultures from generation to generation, so they changed a lot over time. I mean, every storyteller, or maybe every town, might have had a slightly different version of the same folktale.
That's right. There's local difference, and that's why we say folk tales are communal. By communal, we mean they reflect the traits and the concerns of a particular community at a particular time. So essentially, the same tale could be told in different communities, with certain aspects of the tale adapted to fit the specific community. Not the plot. The details of what happens in the story would remain constant. That was the thread that held the tale together. But all the other elements, like the location or characters, might be modified for each audience. Okay, so what about fairy tales? They also are found in most cultures, but how are they different from folk tales? I guess the first question is, what is a fairy tale? And don't anyone say, a story with a fairy in it, because we all know that very few fairy tales actually have those tiny magical creatures in them. But what else can we say about them? Mary?
Well, they seem to be less realistic than folk tales. Like, they have something improbable happening. A frog turning into a prince, say. Oh, that's another common element. Royalty, a prince or princess. And fairy tales all seem to take place in a location that's nowhere and everywhere at the same time.
What's the line? How do all those stories start? Once upon a time in a faraway land. Well, in the case of folk tales, each storyteller would specify a particular location and time, though the time and location would differ for different storytellers. With fairy tales, however, the location is generally unspecified, no matter who the storyteller is. That land far away. We'll come back to this point in a few minutes.
I thought a fairy tale was just the written version of an oral folktale.
Well, not exactly, though that is how many fairy tales developed. For example, in the late 18th century, the Grimm brothers traveled throughout what's now Germany, recording local folk tales. These were eventually published as fairy tales, but not before undergoing a process of evolution. Now, a number of things happen when an oral tale gets written down. First, the language changes. It becomes more formal, more standard. Some might say less colorful. It's like the difference in your language depending on whether you're talking to someone or writing them a letter. Second, when an orally transmitted story is written down, an authoritative version with a recognized author is created. The communal aspect gets lost. The tale no longer belongs to the community. It belongs to the world, so to speak. Because of this, elements like place and time can no longer be tailored to suit a particular audience, so they become less identifiable, more generalizable to any audience. On the other hand, descriptions of characters and settings can be developed more completely. In folk tales, characters might be identified by a name, but you wouldn't know anything more about them. But in fairy tales, people no longer have to remember plots. They're written down, right? So more energy can be put into other elements of the story, like character and setting. So you get more details about the characters, about where the action takes place, what people's houses were like, whether they're small cabins or grand palaces. And it's worth investing that energy because the story, now in book form, isn't in danger of being lost. Those details won't be forgotten. If a folk tale isn't repeated by each generation, it may be lost for all time. But with a fairy tale, it's always there in a book, waiting to be discovered again and again. Another interesting difference involves the change in audience, who the stories are meant for. Contrary to what many people believe today, folk tales were originally intended for adults, not for children. So why is it that fairy tales seem targeted toward children nowadays?
What is the lecture mainly about? What does the professor mean when he says that folk tales are communal? Why does the professor clarify the concept of a fairy? What does the professor say about the setting of fairy tales? In the lecture, the professor discusses characteristics of folk tales and fairy tales. Indicate the characteristics of each type of tale. Listen again to part of the lecture, then answer the question.
And fairy tales all seem to take place in a location that's nowhere and everywhere at the same time.
What's the line? How do all those stories start? Once upon a time in a faraway land.
Why does the professor say this?
What's the line? How do all those stories start? Once upon a time in a faraway land.